Welcome, everybody, to the Smooth Brain Society. I'm Sahir. And just before we started with episode 50, I wanted to give a little message to thank everybody. Thank all the people who've been listening to the podcast over the past 2 years, all the people following us on our social media platforms and on Spotify and YouTube. Thank you for all your support and help. Also wanted to thank all the co-hosts who've been part of the 50 episodes so far, and Jeremy and Alap who have done all the artwork, which I use, and the logo on the back and things like that. So thank you all. If you want to keep supporting the show, please leave comments, like and share the videos, the TikToks, everything we make. Sign up to our Patreon at Smooth Brain Society at patreon.com. All the links to everything will be on our website, smoothbrainsociety.com. And yeah, thank you and enjoy the episode. Welcome everybody to the Smooth Brain Society, episode 50. I've been doing this for 2 years now. Incredible. And we've got a really special guest today, Dr. Nuzha Saleem. She is a teaching fellow at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. Her research areas of interest include educational resilience, refugee and migrant background youth, identity, and belonging. Also, in addition, she is an artist, a published author, and can often be seen on most of the diversity posts at Victoria University of Wellington. But yeah, welcome to the show, Nuzha.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad I'm finally on here. For those of you who don't know, Sahir has asked me a few times and I've always said no for a really long time, and now has finally got me. So
Yes,
here I am. Yeah.
that's the real reason why I said special episode, because I've been trying since about episode 10 to get Nuzha on, and now it's 50. So it's been 2 years in the making. Um, and as you know, the premise of the show is we have a co-host on, and usually the way it goes is the co-host has no clue about the research work, but in this case I actually do not know a lot about Nuzha's work, but my co-host today does. So Niusha Aryan is on as the co-host. She has a background of about 8 to 9 years in youth work and is currently doing a PhD, as well as is part of the clinical psychology program at Victoria University of Wellington, although at the moment she just came back from surfing in Hawaii, so doing neither. Um, Her doctoral research explores the psychological well-being of migrant and refugee youth in New Zealand specifically. She wants to understand how these young people are doing when it comes to psychological well-being and what factors facilitate it. Is that about right, Nisha?
Yeah, it's a good little snapshot.
Awesome. See, I remember your work. Um, awesome. But yeah, thank you, Nisha, for coming on. Welcome, Nuzha. Uh, we'll start where we start with all our guests, and the first question is, could you give us a little bit of a background into your life and how you decided to come into doing a PhD, and your research topic as well, why the focus on refugee and migrant youth? And
I'm really bad at a question that's like a four-part question. So if I don't answer parts of your question, then just feel free to ask me again. Um, yeah, so I moved from the Middle East to go to Otago in Dunedin. And I did a double major in psychology and neuroscience. And then I did my honors. And you get to that point in your life where you're like, well, what am I going to do now? And I was kind of sure that I wanted to go into research, not 100%. So I took a year off and I did some research assistant work in my supervisor's lab at that time. And I was kind of getting more and more in touch with, I guess, because of social media and that kind of stuff, learning more about the refugee crisis, especially after Syria, and more people were crossing or making that Mediterranean crossing. And one of the pieces of information or world news that kind of like made it to my Instagram, because my Instagram at the time was very curated to just like fun things, was the picture of the little boy washed up on the shore in Greece. And I think that really stayed with me. It was just one of those things I couldn't shake off. And more specifically, actually, there was a picture I remember, like an illustration of all of these world leaders kind of like standing over. I don't know if this was like a really famous picture at that time, but it was like a picture that I saw of all these world leaders essentially standing over an illustration of his body washed up on the shore. And I think it was very much symbolic of the world refugee crisis, in that it goes ignored a lot of the time by um, people in power and government officials and those kinds of things. And so I guess following that, I essentially had this decision to make around, I like research, I can carry on doing neuropsych, or I can shift into something else. And I just decided to do this complete 180 shift. Personally, on a personal level, I really needed to move out of Dunedin. It was just getting far too small for me. And most of my friends were up here in Punaki anyway, so I moved up here. There was the CACR, or the cross cultural, what does it stand for? Yeah, sorry, when it'll come to me and I'll tell you. Um, it's a research center essentially that does cross cultural work, and so I moved up here to be a part of the center and do that kind of work um, here. Does that answer your question? Did I answer all of your parts?
Yeah, you answered every single part.
Cool.
That was very impressive, actually. All right. But then even within that, now that you moved from, say, neuroscience work to cross-cultural work, even within that, you'd have to sort of pick topics or pick sort of what you want to look at or how you want to look at something. So how was that journey as well? Because I feel somebody who's been doing neuroscience, like you said, it's 180. So how was that process as well? How was that shift into?
The first thing I want to say is that I quickly kind of realized that my research was not cross-cultural. So it's one of those like learnings that you take away, right? Like you think that you fit in somewhere, and then you kind of look at the research that's being done within the center. And especially at that time, I think more so now, my research would probably fit in, but at that time it was very academically cross-cultural in the way that they were like looking between cultures at certain things, very around, Hofstede's cultural dimensions, like those kinds of pieces of work. And I was very much interested in not really looking between cultures, but looking at one specific group, which was young people from refugee backgrounds. So I didn't quite fit in with the CACR, but I guess you could call it like CACR adjacent. Like
Yeah.
I still had like a supervisor in there, and I would go to a lot of the seminars and stuff. Um, and in terms of switching out of neuroscience, I do remember it being like a genuine grieving process. Like there was a moment in my brain where I went, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to actually do or like work with like brains, or like I was in neuropsychology, so a lot of like sensation perception, that kind of stuff. And I just remember going, whoa, I'm never going to be able to do this again. And a friend of mine at that time said to me, neuroscience exists like outside of academia, right? Like you can still read books and stuff. And I went, oh yeah, okay. And that was really just like the only part of that decision that that piece of information helped me kind of like switch into making this decision, because um, it was a really hard decision. It was really hard for me to switch out of something that I loved towards something that I felt I needed to do. Um, but yeah, I guess in the end, like the decision to switch into something that I felt I needed to do just matched better, aligned better with like a value system. And that was really important to me, because that was kind of the thing that I thought would see me through to like the end of the PhD anyway. So yeah, so that's kind of how I ended up making that decision. And it's quite funny actually, because I don't actually think I've read a single neuroscience book since I finished. my neuroscience degree. I just never had the time. And then every time you do want to read something, you're just reading things that's like in your field. Because like anyone that's done a PhD knows that you wholly know nothing about anything. So you're just like, oh, I need to know all this information. So you're just reading all this stuff that's in your field. And I haven't picked up a single book in neuroscience, which is quite sad.
I have a quick question. Just
Yeah.
reflecting on that. What is it? 5 years? 3 years?
Since I've finished my
PhD? No, since you started your PhD.
I took 4 years in total to do my PhD, but 5.5 if you include the 1.5 years I was stuck overseas during COVID.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So since that time, do you regret anything? Do you want to go back and do neuroscience, or are you happy with where your academic trajectory has now?
No, absolutely no regrets in having switched out. Yeah, no way. I think especially because one of the things that really kept me doing my PhD was feeling like there was, like that I really felt like strongly about the topic. And, like with neuroscience, I was passionate about the topic, but I don't know that it was like values aligned. It felt like a fun project, like something that you're really curious about. You're like, cool, I'd love to do that, but it didn't. And I mean, for a lot of people, that's a good enough reason to do it. That's a great reason to do it, if you find something fun. But I think looking back on like the last 4 years, I would have definitely needed something more. Like I would have definitely needed something that felt like I could, and I don't know, it's probably going to sound like cheesy, but just like you could feel it in your heart, kind of, like the work felt important, especially as you start working with the community. You're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I thought I was going to do neuroscience, and you feel like a sense of accountability towards doing that kind of work. So then it just felt like true to me. Yeah.
No, that's nice. Going back to reading neuroscience books, you can listen to the podcast instead. It works just as well.
This is true. I do listen to a lot of the shorts of the podcast. I love the little like the reels that you do on
Yeah.
on Instagram. But I'm not on Instagram anymore, so we'll see about that.
We need to find a different way to get the reels to you.
You're just constantly trying to get to me.
From halfway around the world, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, I want to ask you, because we've skirted around it a little bit, but what was the actual topic of your research, or the topic of your PhD mainly? But then you've done some research afterwards as well. So what was it focused on?
So I'm not going to tell you the topic of my thesis.
Yeah.
Because I wrote the topic of my thesis as the last thing I did before I submitted my thesis. And anyone who submitted a thesis knows the headspace you're in before you hit that like submit button. It is not a headspace where you want to type any more words. And just as you like type a massive discussion and they're like, now summarize this whole thing into 15 words, I was like, and then it's actually quite funny, in my examiner's feedback, one of my feedback was, this is a really amazing thesis, but can we please change the title? So I did end up changing the title to something that is much more of like a mouthful. But it is around young people from refugee backgrounds, and specifically here in Aotearoa, and what it is that they need to have like successful resettlement and to thrive in schools and within the education sector. So not just schools, but like university and that sort of stuff. So that's kind of broadly what I looked at. Did you have a follow-up question?
I'm going to ask a follow-up question now. So when you say you looked at what they could do. So was your research more about outcome focused, as in how certain things can be fixed, or was it more about describing the problem or the issues faced or the barriers faced by people or refugee migrant youth?
So when I eventually switched into, sorry, I'm going to have to give you a little bit of context to then tell you what it's about.
Of course, of
When I
course.
switched into doing this Mahi, I, obviously I had no background in it. Like I didn't have a political science background. I didn't even do a single social psychology paper in undergrad. So I had like zero knowledge. And so obviously like Googling a lot of this stuff to learn and then meeting people in the community and that kind of stuff. And I was very aware that there was like this discrepancy between what I was hearing from people in the community and what I was reading online. And so that was my first little bit of, oh, what's going on here? And primarily, I think the difference was that a lot of the literature was pathologizing refugees. A lot of it was around like PTSD, trauma, um, like like depression, anxiety, those kinds of things. And then here I was kind of like meeting these people from who have a refugee background, who've come here from situations that are that the way the literature describes, to be honest, was the exact same situation. Like there wasn't any difference in terms of like the description of what they were or had been through. But they were like in schools, they were doing really well, they were getting really good grades, not only just getting good grades, but like, top of their class, straight A students. And obviously some of that had to do with the fact that like I was in a university environment, so those are the kinds of people I was meeting. But eventually once you meet friends of friends of friends of friends, and then you go into schools and you're going to community events and stuff, you meet a whole array of people. And I am not a clinical psychologist, so I wasn't interested in like anxiety and depression and those things anyway. But I was really interested in like what is happening here. And very early on, I think I felt this responsibility to tell the truth. And I kind of wanted to change that narrative, or move away from kind of like a deficit-based narrative into a strengths-based one and tell like a more balanced story. I don't actually think that like those statistics are not true. I just think that the conversation has like disproportionately shifted into um, trauma and anxiety and depression and those kinds of things. And so I think my like intention or attempt was to use my thesis as a way to like slowly kind of move that maybe a little bit more to the center. And so my first study was a quant study because to the best of my knowledge, we don't actually have any quantitative information about young people from refugee backgrounds here in New Zealand. And I kind of went, well, I need a starting point. And when I started my thesis in like 2019, there was very little information out there about young people from refugee backgrounds, how they were doing in schools, because that's essentially what I was interested in. And I found the Youth 19 study, which is the largest adolescent like health study in New Zealand, and it was at that time the only study I could find that had asked people, "Did you come to New Zealand as a refugee?" So it was able to like capture the cohort of people that I was interested in, and that's kind of where I started. And you could select questions and that kind of stuff. So the first study was really just an exploratory study to give me something to kind of like go, okay, this is what overall we kind of know, and now I can kind of take this and then figure out what my next study is. My second study was a qual study, which was really where I think the like like the nitty gritty kind of stuff came out. And I basically just went in there asking young people what their educational experiences were. And the other thing I was really interested in was that I was interested in looking at it from like 3 different time points. So again, the way that young people from refugee backgrounds, or even just people with a former refugee background, like adults, generally get surveyed or sampled or whatever is once they're in a Western context or a post-resettlement context. That's what we call it, like just a context where you have gone from your native country, you've moved to a transmigrational point, and then moved to a Western country and I kind of, generally the literature will call that Western country a post-resettlement context, and then everything else is pre-resettlement. And so I really just wanted to look at all three time points, because I kind of went, well, it's really weird that someone would ask about your life at this specific place as if like nothing else had kind of happened or like led up to that point. Like that's not even true for any of us, you know, like that's not true for someone that was like born and raised here, who's in high school. Like if you just ask a high schooler what's happening in high school without kind of gauging what's happening in like middle school, that's really weird. And so I really wanted to know like what had happened in their native countries for them to move. And I also wanted to know like, and this came up in interviews, which was just an organic way that the interviews would happen, I think. But like who are they as a student in their native countries? You know, like we all got to have that experience without any disruption, right? To some extent. And so there's like this, like who are you as a young person when you were just being raised without any like pressures of like war, conflict, or whatever. And so I asked all those three time points. And then my last study, which Niusha was a part of, which was really great, was an application study. And that study was entirely because I felt obligated to give something back to the community and move away from kind of extractive research methods that academic research is just so well known for. And so I used a lot of like social psych theory to develop a game, and then tested the game. And so my third study was kind of a piloting of that game.
So within the field, there's sometimes kind of ethical concerns around asking about pre-journey and journey, experiences. So is that something you kind of thought about, just in terms of how it can be used later on, once you've collected that data, how that data can be used to kind of affect people's kind of immigration applications and so forth, and a whole host of other things? Is that something that you kind of thought about? How did you navigate that? How did you kind of mitigate that within your question in that study?
I remember getting my revisions back from the ethics committee, and the thing that they were mostly focused on was like re-traumatizing the youth that I was going to speak to. They were not really concerned with how I was going to use that information, mostly because I think the ethics committee is relatively good at keeping data anonymized and that kind of stuff. So like even when I submitted my thesis to the library, I could submit a redacted version. So in that version, I kind of just like took out or any not even identifying information, but like in my original thesis, I had obviously pseudonyms, but I also had biographies to my participants to give the reader context. I don't think that someone just walking off the street should have access to that information. So I took all that information out. And I do think it might, like if you're a person just downloading my thesis off the library and reading it, it might be a little bit difficult to follow, because I kind of wrote a lot of it based on the fact that the reader had read that. But again, it came down to that, right? It came down to like, I don't want people to be able to access this information and to put my participants in a situation where they might be able to be identified. And just kind of constantly, I guess, like keeping that at the back of my mind, being really, really clear over and over again with my participants about like where this information is going to go. And then also just like giving my participants things like not just their transcripts, but like parts of my thesis to read and like decide if they're okay with kind of that being out there in the world. Yeah, I think it's just like just being careful and being open with your participants and like just transparency. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
You brought up a lot of different points in your answer there, and there were so many different topics which I wanted to touch on. The first one which I wanted to touch on was also links back to someone who had come on when we had done a refugee special episode, Kodri and Ishai. I think you know him.
Yeah.
Um, and he spoke he spoke a little bit about how trauma is often used. He hates the idea that trauma is used, but he says that trauma is often used as a key source for funding for for anything refugee related. And do you feel that, as someone who is clearly focused on the more positive aspects, uh, do you feel that it is that case? Do you think that it is a lot harder to sort of find funding or get money for like sort of positive approaches or showcasing positive results, and you need to kind of highlight trauma and highlight PTSD and highlight those numbers in order to get governments active or any funding resources active?
Um, I think that has been the case, especially, a lot of this work has been done in Australia, like as in terms of when I was doing my thesis, just to be able to get some anchoring, I would use a lot of research that had been done in Australia. And I spoke to someone very early on in my thesis journey who spoke about this exact point of like the need for researchers and health professionals to highlight the mental health statistics and stuff to show or that the government only responds if you portray a certain group as a health burden. And I do think that that is a way to get funding. I don't think that that's the only way to get funding. And I think for me, I would much rather tell the truth and get funding than blow something out of proportion, contributing ultimately to like a negative stereotype and get funding. And there are so many different ways, like even with my study, even though it was strengths based, I often would ask them about the challenges they were facing in education. And I think one of the advantages that I had was because I went just hard pass to all the trauma stuff. I got to kind of solely focus in education. And it's not like it's all great, right? So they do speak about challenges in education. And I think there is a way that we can frame those challenges in a way that makes it a governmental responsibility to respond to those challenges. And so I think so much of it is also just around framing, right? Like if you're gonna, as a government, decide that you're gonna respond to a crisis that's happening and bring people over here, then it is equally your responsibility to figure out how you're going to resettle these people successfully, right? So, and that's just not just like their health, but their education, their housing, all of those things. And so I think I think you're right in the way that yes, that's historically what's been done for a really long time. And I think that everyone else now kind of coming up, especially here, because we have so much like great examples of how things have been done overseas, really need to think about like what that means in the long term and then move away from it, because ultimately, at least for me, because I don't come from a refugee background, I think like against some of it is also positionality, right? Like it's fair for Kodrian to say that because he's from a refugee background, but for me, as someone who doesn't come from a refugee background, I think how I contribute the narrative is really important. And so I don't know that I want to tell half truths to get a piece of funding. And I also just kind of want to stay in my lane because, like I said, there are challenges in education that are real challenges that we can use to get funding, because it's not like it's great there, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, as you've been researching in this space, working in this space, I mean, I know that you yourself have done some community work while you've been doing your PhD. How have you found, I guess, some of your learnings around like what supports there are for young people, you know, refugee youth that are coming to Aotearoa? Are they well supported? Is this a priority for the government? Is there research in this area? Like, how have you kind of found the field to be? And um, what are some of your
Yeah.
kind of learnings of the last few years?
So what I understand about that is that when they get here, they are all given and Kadrian might have shared this around service provision, a volunteer from the Red Cross who kind of supports them with like getting into schools and stuff. The first issue with that is that it's a volunteer position. So if they kind of decide tomorrow that like they're too busy and they don't want to do it, then it takes a really long time again for a young person or a family really to be paired up again with another volunteer. And sometimes that results in things like they don't enroll in school as quickly as they need to because they don't actually know where to go, what schools are appropriate, or even just the education system. As a whole, I would say that in speaking to a lot of the people, the biggest gap was that for whatever reason, they were not being informed of how the education system here worked. Which, when you speak to them, seems like such an easy fix, right? Like you just you sit them down in the first day and you go, this is what you need to do for this year. Then next year comes and goes, this is what you need to do for next year, you know? And then in terms of like the 6 weeks, so when they get here, they spend 6 weeks at the Mangere Resettlement Center. And they do orientation there. And even there, they just get so much information that it's just an information overload and they just don't know what's appropriate for when, right? Because they get like a 6-week English intensive language training. The parents get a workshop on how to raise their kids here. Some of them get like, and then you get information about school, you get information about housing, you get just everything, right? And it's just a lot. Like I did a 1-day international orientation, student orientation, and I was like, you know, like that's just 1 day. This is like 6 weeks of information and learning a new language. So I can imagine it's really hectic. And then it's like, okay, well, we don't know what information we need to lean into as different situations arise, right? And so with the people that I spoke to, there was a lot around just not knowing how the education system worked. So they all came from a very like classic education system. And I think I use the word classic because it's the education system I came from, where you just do like subjects and those subjects follow through all the way to the end of high school. And you can pick and drop subjects as you move through grades, but you do a whole subject. We didn't have like a credit system. And so they didn't understand that they had to take a certain number of credits to get a certain grade. And so like this one young person said that they did like all of it, like everything that was offered that year they did. And they only got to the end. And then the teacher was like, why did you do all of this? And they were like, well, what was I supposed to do? And they were like, we were only supposed to do this number of credits for this. And they were like, oh, well, nobody told me that, you know? So like, there's this just like lack of understanding of how things work in general. I do think that in terms of like post high school, there's quite a few scholarships I've been seeing come up for people from refugee backgrounds, which has been really cool. But I think there's some sort of gap that exists between the young person and then getting that information to the young person. And so just within just like the actual help that the government affords to them, you have to really be falling like not falling, but like you have to be really struggling in school for a teacher to then access funding from the Ministry of Education through a refugee student advisor. So I think there are like 6 or 7 across the country, and then they get in touch, and then so they provide whatever resources the teacher needs or whatever resources the student needs, but that's only under like special circumstances. And so what's interesting about that is that it's great because in some ways, you do have provision for the students that are not able to do super well within the system as soon as they get here. But the unfair, or I don't know if unfair is the right word, but like the unfortunate thing is that you could have students that are just struggling in other ways. Like it's not just academics in school that kids are concerned about. And so there are all these other ways that kids could be struggling that has no provision attached to it. Yeah, and so there were like a whole bunch of kids that are probably like falling between the cracks, and there are no services that they can then access. And like one of the questions I asked young people were like, I think one of the questions I asked them was, what's a question you would ask someone if you were in my position? And they would always talk about provision. Like, I would ask about what access they had to scholarships. I would ask about like what access they had to, tutors and doing homeworks, like that kind of stuff. That's like what they wanted to know about. So there's a real need there for other services, and like everything else I heard of, like homework clubs, all of that was like community put together. Like someone in the community realized they didn't have it, put it together by community members, volunteers doing stuff here, like someone just meeting someone, realizing they needed a tutor. Okay, I'll do that. Like, yeah, it was sad, I suppose, to see that there was so few services. Yeah.
I wanted to start with the 6 weeks which you said orientation, because that hit me in the sense that the international orientation is 1 or 2 days and you get so much information you forget about it. Or there's no way you can remember it. And then for someone who is essentially has been moved across the world, and in 6 weeks you're getting everything being told to you that you need to do. And then for the kids not knowing, it's because for parents, it probably wasn't a priority that the kids need to know this. It's not that all the kids have been told. They might be, I do not know how the services work, but that there's that level of understanding, which can also go that level of care, of priority, of there might be a sort of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of thing, where, okay, first housing and food, then we can worry about how many courses you take in school. And that in itself, how it's such a simple thing which can potentially be fixed without much of an effort, but it just needs to be paid attention to.
Yeah, I think like if I was to fix it, the first thing I would do is give them information when they need information, because the biggest disadvantage of that is the chucking of information like all at once. I will, however, say that the young people that I spoke to, there's mixed feelings about this, because the overarching message you get is that it's awful and it's too much information. But when you speak to the young people, a lot of them said it was really nice because that's where they made their first friends. And the other thing that I noticed about what they were saying, it wasn't just making friends. It was the fact that they were making friends with people who they saw had been in a similar situation to them. And so there was some sort of bonding in that. And there was a real like sadness with like leaving that place, because once you go there and you're there for 6 weeks, you then get resettled in a different part of the country. So it's not always the case that you would then get resettled in the same place as this friend that you had made, right? And a lot of the young people also said that it was the first time they were like beginning to get some sort of like formalized education, and there was so much excitement in that. Like, oh, we're going to school. We can like pack a bag and like head to school, and we're there for X amount of time. Like even if it was like 2 hours and they were just learning English, it was just such an exciting time for them. So I do think that like depending on what age you come here, I think that's a big factor. You are either really excited because you're kind of sensing some level of safety, or you're making friends. And so the information overload is probably something a lot of the adults feel, because they're like responsible for these kids, but also responsible for getting a job, sending the kids to school, um, making a home, I suppose, because they've been putting like social housing, that kind of stuff. So the information overload definitely is for the adults, and I think the kids maybe like sense that anxiety, and then especially because once they get reallocated or resettled in whatever part of the country, they then have to kind of think about, like, they obviously want to go to school. Maybe it's not a priority for their parents. Like, I had everything between it took me 2 months to get into school, or like half a year to get in school, to we got put in social housing. The next day I went to school. Like, so there's such a big difference between the way kids are getting into school, or the time frame of when kids are getting to school. And I think it's a combination of the priority that parents have, and the lack of like someone going, like a volunteer that's like, okay, here's what we're going to do in the week. Yeah, like the week following resettlement. Yeah.
Did young people speak about any of, because you kind of know that often with refugee youth, they pick up things and learn things a lot faster than their parents. They'll pick up the language, they'll learn the systems, and and it can take the parents a while to do that stuff. And also they're doing a million other things. And so the young people end up kind of taking on a bit more responsibility. Did your young people kind of speak to that a little bit? I don't actually know. I actually don't know what the age of your participants were, and I feel like I should know this because I read your thesis.
You're probably like the only person who's actually read parts of my thesis, so it's fine that you don't. I had such a mixed group. So I had between 19 and 24. But it was also like, after I had done all of my interviews, it also became significant to me that I had a group of young people that had been in New Zealand for like less than 10 years, and then a group of young people who had come here much, much younger, so had been in New Zealand for much longer. And so it really depended on like who they were. But in general, across the board, all the young people picked up language quicker than their parents, because they all started going to school. And then once they started picking up language, there was definitely that like swift transition into the young person becoming the adult, helping their parents like navigate a lot of like form filling and correspondence with their teachers, and taking their parents to doctors' offices and those kinds of things, which absolutely was like a big part of like one of the three themes in my entire thesis was family dynamics, because it was a big part of what they would talk about. But again, I think like, even like when you think about what the literature says about that, a lot of the time the literature speaks about it as a burden that the young people feel that the parents put on their on their kids. And I don't know, like, I would love to sit and listen to the other people's recordings about this, because like over and over again what I could hear was that the kids were also just so happy to support their parents. Like there was such a wholesome narrative around that, and like this idea of like, we want to do well so that we can help our parents. We want to do well so that we can send money back home to people that we left behind, was a big thing. We want to do well so that we can support the community that supported us when we got here. So like part of what they have done, or what they continue to do, they see as a way of giving back to their parents. Yeah. So I don't know that like, and I mean, they and it's the way they speak about it as well. They'll talk about it like, yeah, like it really prevented me from like making friends or like hanging out because I had to be at home to do this. But like I was so happy to help, like things like that. They'll say it in one breath. And so it's kind of hard to like read a paragraph of script and go, I'm just going to ignore this and just focus on the top bit. It just seems like such a disservice. But yeah, that's kind of what I got. I got one of my sub things was education is a luxury that must be paid forward. Yeah.
Shows how important that nuance is, right? That's often
Yeah.
in this literature and in this research.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I feel as someone who is not in that space, the top headline is what you'd most likely associate with. Be like, oh, kids are probably more burdened, don't really get to make friends, so and so. But like you said, if you look at the nuance, it's a lot different.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't paint the same picture.
I mean, it's called stuff in the literature like familial acculturative gap. That's what it's called. It's the gap that you have with your family from having come to a culture that's different, and the uptake of that culture is different to the uptake of the culture for your family, and then all of the challenges that come as a result of this uptake being different, like communication, styles, parenting styles, all that kind of stuff. And there's absolutely nothing about like, the kids feeling like it's a pleasure almost some in hindsight, for them to have been able to do that for their parents. Yeah. I don't know.
Can I ask then, were there differences between between the different refugee backgrounds, or where migrants came from? Were there any differences there? Does that play a role?
Like between
So between countries, for example, just for context, one of my friends works in Germany, and she said there's a big difference between Ukrainian versus Syrian refugees, not just in how they were treated. That's one thing, but also, of course, uptake for some was way easier than others. Did you see
uptake of what?
like being able to what do you say, being able to fit within culture, picking up language, and so on was easier for some than others, or volunteers are being more willing to help, or more willing to help one type of refugee over others?
I
Did
mean, the UK.
those? Yeah. I didn't want to say it, but sure. you know. Um, but I
Yeah,
think my point,
yeah.
but my thing, I think my thing was more about just whether the country they came from had an influence on how well they were able to, go through the process.
Some communities are a lot more established as a community in Wellington. And so they have more community services that mean that those specific young people just had a lot more support when they got here. So, for example, in Wellington, the Somali community is quite established. And so those who had come from um, and the wave of Somali refugees happened years and years ago. And so if they had a more established community, then they just seem to like fit in a lot better because they just were connected into the community a lot better. And I suspect that with Syrian refugees, the Syrian refugees happened like all at once and quickly and big, right? And so, in terms of the country being able to respond, we here in New Zealand have this because we're not so close to the epicenter of the refugee crisis. A lot of the way that refugees come to New Zealand is through UNHCR referrals, and the government going, yeah, we'll take that person, that person, that person, that person, and that person. We don't have like waves of refugees traveling across land or sea to get here. And you would think that that means we have better services to support them, but we don't. And so I think maybe that's where some of this, like, oh, we don't know what to do with the Syrian refugees comes from. The fact that the country was just not prepared because they don't put a lot of funding into, or at least I don't think put enough funding into that level of preparation. And then all of those like extra things is actually done by the community. So like homework clubs is done by the community. Mentorship is done by the community. So the Syrian refugees just didn't have that set up for them. And so a lot of that need to respond was all of the government services, which was like kind of the bare minimum. At least here, that's kind of what I think happened. Was that your question?
Yeah, mostly. I think that gives a good idea of probably, because I was thinking more like something which happened in their own countries might influence their the way they are, their ability to sort of I don't like the word assimilate, but I guess that's the most appropriate here, or like be able to integrate. Yeah. Um, I would have thought something like that. So, for
I
example,
mean, I don't really like the word integrate either, but Niush, do you have a better
I was going to say, what do you think? I mean, just because you used that specific example of Ukrainian refugees and Syrian
of what?
refugees,
Sorry.
I'm just saying, Sahir, since you used that really specific example of Ukrainian refugees and Syrian refugees, I mean, what do you think, Nuz, in terms of culturally, Ukrainian refugees might be a little bit more aligned with German culture, and then in terms of like racism and how people are perceived within the country, and how they're received and the supports they're given.
Yeah.
it wasn't just that. So racism was one aspect, but the other aspect which I was thinking was, for example, people who had degrees in Ukraine were able to sort of work, while a Syrian degree, or actually one of my friends from Colombia, a Colombian degree did not hold weight in New Zealand,
Yeah.
and therefore they could not
Yeah.
work. One of my friends, again refugee from former Yugoslavia, his parents formerly, they could not work here, although one was a doctor and then they did something else, but that clearly hampers their ability to integrate, right? So I was wondering whether in the people you met, did that also affect their kids? Because yeah.
None of the young people spoke about, at least the best of my knowledge, none of the young people spoke about this degree conversion thing, but it absolutely is an issue that we have here. The fact that the process of converting your degree is not just really, really slow, but it's also really, really expensive. So, like, I know, for example, that to sit the dental exams here in New Zealand as someone who's coming from overseas as a dentist, it costs $7,000. And if you have, yeah, like that's heaps of money. And where do you get that money once you've kind of like put your kid in school? It's like an impossible ask. And also there are things around like if you fail it a certain number of times, you can't do it again. If you fail it, you don't get the money back. You have to then resit it. And then there are like 3 exams, I think, that you have to do to be able to get it. So there absolutely is that like lack of understanding that these people are coming with like really great skills, and the fact that we're not creating a system that allows those skills to be translated into something that's usable here or to the standard that we have here. And then they can carry on working in the sector, because the truth is we also know that New Zealand really needs nurses and doctors and dentists and psychologists, right? And a lot of our current workforce is going over to Australia. So wouldn't it be great if we could figure out how to convert these people's degrees so that when they come here, they can like convert it, start working? I also think that it's like a big, it's another reason why that familial acculturated gap exists. Because the thing is, the young people pick up language not because they're forced to learn it in school, but because they are going to school and they're being surrounded by people who speak English, right? And then the parents end up being in jobs where it's more people like them, so like Syrian, Somali, Ethiopian, whatever country they come from, where those people within their own ethnic groups are pulling them into these jobs through contacts and stuff, and they are in the workforce, and so they carry on speaking their own language, right? But like, if you recognize their degrees, they would probably pick up English a lot quicker. Like heaps of teachers that come from overseas, you know, and like that's another one, like doing a teaching degree or going into teaching college. The part that gets me though, every time, the part that like actually pisses me off is the fact that New Zealand thinks their degrees are just like the most amazing high class. Like, have you met an Indian doctor? Like, come on. It's crazy to me that they think that their standard is so high that these people somehow cannot make it. You know, like partly it's the language, right? Like they've done their entire lives in one language, done their entire professions in one language, and now they come here. But again, it's like it's weird to me that like you don't want to grasp onto that workforce, like pull that workforce in, get them into jobs that they actually genuinely like. So many tradies, you know, like carpenters and builders and plumbers. Like, I just don't, I, for the life of me, have not been able to understand why the government does not want to get onto this like ASAP.
It's it's funny, right? As the doctors think it's funny, like you said, the Indian doctors. I'm pretty sure the symptoms for heart attack are the same in all over the world. Like, I don't think your blood cell ratios change everywhere. I think the same. Well, I was about to say the same diseases don't exist everywhere. Well, because they don't. Certain
Yeah.
diseases come from certain places, but the thing of like diagnosis, you would have learned the same things. It's about just getting the language sorted,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Once I have an answer for that, we can go ahead and do another podcast, but I have no answers for you.
Well, hopefully that's sooner rather than later. Um, I I wanted to ask about your third study because it's been on my mind since you said you designed a game, and Niusha was part of it. So then both of you can talk about it and tell me what was this game, what was the purpose of it. Yeah.
So one of the biggest things about my findings that we haven't actually spoken about was that I kind of went in being like, tell me about school. And they kept telling me about their friends. That was just over and over again, just about friendship, 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 friendship. I think by like my sixth participant, I was like, I'm asking the wrong questions. This is kind of ridiculous. I've just focused on the wrong things, which is also hilarious because I initially was like, I'm not going to do PTSD and I'm going to do education. And I was like, still wrong because it's so much further, you know, like what they really care about is making friends in school, especially in like
In
high school.
in the kids' defense,
Yeah.
I don't remember anything from high school, but I remember my friends. So
Yeah. You
I
would,
think if
and
you
that's the
asked
thing.
me,
Yeah, like that's the thing, right? Like sometimes when you're an academic, you're like, I'm going to look at the literature. When like if someone just off the street had been like, yo, Nuzha, what do you think matters the most in high school? I'd be like, oh, my friends were great. You know,
exactly.
like you just instinctively just know sometimes the answer, and then you're like, well, why is the literature telling me? Yeah. Um,
I know three things, right? I got friends. I know mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and I heard of this thing called Pythagoras theorem. That's about it.
oh, Pythagoras theorem. Yeah, that was a good one. I still don't know what the two sides equals the other side. No.
Square. So it's
Yes.
the sum of the square.
Yeah. I remember quadratic equations.
God.
Anyway, um, sorry, what were you saying?
Oh, so yeah, so you're telling about you had
Friendship.
found friendship, yeah.
Yeah. And so one of the themes in my studies was around young people struggling to make friends. The nuance to this story is that often people say that the reason why young people struggle to make friends is because of the language, but a lot of them had already told me the story about like how they made friends with other people who didn't know the language in the first 6 weeks in orientation. So I was going, well, why can they make friends with these people, but they can't make friends with anyone else? And then the friend groups that they make at ESOL, which is the service that's offered in schools across the country for very poorly funded, but for young people to learn English. is again where they make friends, right? Because they're like, we both don't know English, but it doesn't necessarily mean that both of those young people speak the same language, right? So it's like a Syrian person making friends with like someone from Ethiopia, and they become best friends, and they just like sign or like talk somehow. So I was really curious about that, because I was going, well, why are they not able to do that with Pakeha? And that was kind of where the pain point was, that they wanted to be friends with Pakeha and they were not able to. And so it never seemed enough that they had friends from their own ethnic group or like other people from refugee backgrounds. They wanted to make friends with Pakeha. And so, and that had a lot to do with like, and I mean, Niush knows a lot of this research as well, because we talk about this a lot around like belonging, and how in order to feel like they belong to Aotearoa, they feel that they need to make friends or have some sort of relationship with Pakeha. And so I kind of got interested in like intergroup friendships, and that kind of led me into the intergroup contact hypothesis, which is like social psychology 101. But of course, I had never heard of it because I had never done social psychology. So I was like telling my supervisor, like, Mark, oh my God, you know, like when, and he was like, that's intergroup contact hypothesis. And I was like, what is it? So that was kind of embarrassing. But I quickly learned that it was intergroup contact hypothesis, which is essentially that you bring two people from two different backgrounds together and you make them have a meaningful conversation, prejudice is likely to decrease between the one person and the other. And that can happen like both through like, you know, like even if you like hear about a story about people from your group and another group having an interaction like that just by association, or the fact that you see yourself in this other person, you go, oh, maybe they're not so bad. Like, you know what I mean? Like a direct and an indirect kind of effect, where like where we go, for example, like maybe Sahir, you make friends with someone from Venezuela, and I have a real prejudice against people from Venezuela. What's the bet that someone in 10 years is going to cut that bit out in this podcast and use it?
Oh, well.
And I
Nuzha
go,
hates Venezuelans. Oh, well. Damn it.
and I go, well, Sahir and I are brown, and so if Sahir is like made friends with that person from Venezuela, maybe they're not so bad. And so I was more interested in kind of the like deep, engaging conversation that you could have. And the entire game is basically based on the intergroup contact hypothesis around young people kind of exchanging stories. And it's a game because there are rounds, there are tokens, all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to tell you how the game works because I have every intention of making this into a legitimate game.
Okay, cool. Patent pending.
But yes, but that is like the basis of the game.
Nice. Yeah, don't give up more. We need to make money.
Yes. Yeah, because
So,
that's how I'm gonna make money.
academia is underfunded. This podcast is not funded, so please sign up to the Patreon. Nice plug in here.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
What was some of the feedback that you got from the young people when you piloted this game with them?
Are you asking this like deliberately because you were there and you know the feedback?
Yes, of course.
So I'm brown through and through, which means that I forget compliments and I remember all the negatives. So let me try to remember. Okay, so as in general, they definitely enjoyed playing the game. They felt closer to the people that they played the game with. And Niush like helped me remember here because I'm like struggling right now. There was a lot of conversation around like, do we want it to be in like a physical format or do we want it to be like on an app? But mostly they said they enjoyed it, right?
That's what I was going to say. Was my memory of it was getting up from the table that they were all sitting at and a lot of them not wanting to leave and a lot of them being like, wow, like this made me actually just feel so much closer to everybody here. This was really fun. I'd really like love to be able to do this in school. I'd love to be able to do this again. That's what I remember.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of positive feedback. And I think like, you know, you go in and you come out and you're like, oh, okay, this is better ways to like record it. But like when you say that, what I remember is a lot of them exchanging social media handles. And that was really important for me to see, because there's a lot of stuff around like longevity of the relationship in the intergroup contact hypothesis. So like maybe decreases prejudice now, but then what does that mean in the long term? And so like obviously I don't know the extent to how much these people were communicating with each other once they left the room, but the fact that they were interested in, you know, like adding people or adding each other on Instagram. And then I also remember that like there was a ball or something that day, and there was like communication around like, are you going? Are you going? You know, like just the classic stuff that you would do with friends anyway. Like, and so I do remember that, and I also do remember struggling to get them out of the room. Like I was done. Like it was like 4 hours of on a weekend. I was like, okay, you know, like how, yeah. I mean, I loved having them there and it was great. Like I enjoyed it. But I definitely at some point we had to be like, okay, guys, like now we've reached the end, and they had eaten their pizza and everything. And I was like, we really have to go. Yeah, no, it was good feedback. Yeah. Thank you for reminding me.
I remember one of the young people, I think, also said that they didn't have any opportunities in their life to be with such a, like that particular kind of diverse group of, because I think in your, I don't know if you did this on purpose, but did you like specifically recruit quite a diverse set of participants from different, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think they really valued that, and they said they didn't have other opportunities in their life to have those kinds of really deep, open conversations. And I remember there was a lot of learning. Like a lot of the kids kind of were like, wow, I didn't, actually a lot of the whiter kids, I will say, was kind of like, oh, I didn't know, you know, about these experiences. I didn't know that, you know, about any of this stuff. So it was kind of cool to watch that unfold and those important conversations we had. That was
Yeah.
my 2 cents.
Yeah.
That's exciting. I look forward to playing this game when it releases, goes worldwide.
Worldwide. You guys are just making me like more excited to actually get it out there in the world, because I have to feel slump.
Do it. Because it's been about an hour, we'll start sort of wrapping up. So we've got a couple more questions. You said so much about over the past 15-20 minutes. We spoke about how much your participants changed and how they enjoyed not your interviews, your games, being part of the project. But the question is, how did it change you? So has your work changed you as a person?
You know, I actually got this question asked in my defense. One of my examiners actually asked me about this question in my defense, and I was like, absolutely changed me. I think it would have, like, I was fully expecting that it would, especially because I did a lot of the research in my like late 20s, and like your 20s is kind of where lots of things are changing for you anyway. This is the one question that I actually took notes for, or like actually thought about. I think the ways that it changed me was I feel very strongly about how you do research, or how people who work with communities do research, or how I believe research should be done. And I use the word should deliberately. Because of the difference that I see between the literature and the difference I see with actually working with communities. So a couple of those things for me is that I don't believe that you can be a migration researcher without also being in advocacy. I think the two go hand in hand. I feel like if we are going to go into communities and extract this knowledge and information from them, then it absolutely is our responsibility that we're conveying that information to whether it is government or other researchers, or like any other way that it can be done in order to like benefit the community. So I think those two things go hand in hand. The other thing that I feel strongly about is application. I think like academia tends to be quite divorced from converting what we know into resources that can be accessed by the community. So like primarily, and we know this, right? Like primarily the way that we are encouraged to get our information out there is through journals. And I know, like, I mean, that's kind of why you have the podcast, right? Like science communication is really big for you. And I think like for me, it's also about taking all of this information that we have and making it into something, right? Like if I went into the community and I found out that they were struggling to make friends, then doesn't it feels silly to me to go, oh well, sorry, they're struggling to make friends. Okay, now I'm like moving on to the next thing that they're struggling with, instead of going like, well, what can I do about that? And I partially, I think the reason why it exists is because it's not incentivized. And we also tend to be quite like in a vacuum, and we don't like work with people like in gamification or in tech, or there's like a real gap there in like who we collaborate with. Like when we think about collaborators, we think of people like me and Niusha collaborators, right? Niusha does the exact same stuff, and in terms of expertise, we essentially have a similar expertise. Niush probably has more of like a clean expertise than I do, but we have a similar expertise, right? So then in terms of like who do we collaborate with, like cross-disciplinary stuff, I feel strongly about. And so when I think about like how it changed me, I think responsibility. I think it's been really hard for me to go, okay, that was my PhD, now I've packed it up, it's gone. I feel that like I've taken all of this information and it is my responsibility to do something with that information. Yeah.
Oh, that's very nice. Nusha, any questions from you?
So within your research, what were some of the kind of main findings? Like what are some of the big core important things for resettlement for refugees?
Like I said, the friendship was probably the biggest takeaway. Um, Quantitatively, I found that they were doing okay in like schools, like they felt connected to their school. They were feeling cared for in their schools. But I wouldn't put a lot of weight on that quantitative information, because the survey in and of itself, the way it was like given to students, and like the dynamics around how young people feel about doing or answering questions around like staff and authoritarian figures and that kind of stuff. um, and the primary finding from that first study was that they were experiencing more um, like lower well-being or depressive symptoms, and that could be partially explained through like poor quality friendships and familial relationships, so like less support from family and friends, which was why I kind of then went on to do that second study around like asking around the challenges of those things. The three big themes, if I was to like summarize, the last theme was what I told you, the friendship one. The middle one was around like family dynamics, and we kind of touched on that as well, which was like that complete story of like, yes, it's difficult to exist in the familial acculturated gap, but there's all of this other stuff that they love, and love being a part of their families, love giving back to their families, those kinds of things. And the first thing was really around like all of that pre-resettlement education, um, what kind of education they experienced, the lack of provision when they got here, how it was like, for a lot of them, it was like a single teacher who took an interest in them and then gave them all of this access to these resources, or who they knew in schools that they could then reach out to. So again, a lot of that like relation, the capital that exists within those like social bonds, and again around like how they felt so deeply responsible to pay it forward. Like a lot of these students were in high school and they were already like mentoring someone in their community because they had just, figured out the system and that kind of stuff. So those were probably like the key findings, I suppose. Yeah.
Nice. That's a nice short which I can use. Check that up on YouTube.
And then no one will listen to the podcast, which is great.
Now they'll come and listen to the whole thing, then they want to understand, okay, what did each theme mean? And they'll come through. But thank you so much, Nuzha. That was really good. Not as scary.
No, I want to though, if that's okay, answer your question about what I learned from the process. Did you mean PhD process?
Sure, go on. Tell me that as well. That was interpretive question.
Yeah, my biggest piece of advice in hindsight to people is, well, personally, it is to remember that the PhD journey is not linear. I think a lot of us come into doing a PhD as like these high achieving, super ambitious, like doing really well in school kind of students, like just studious people.
Speak for yourself.
Thank you. Kidding. I was not very studious. I was just very hardworking, and I think that's what I'm trying to get at. Like, when you're in honors, you do this like 1 year where you're just like go 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 go, and it feels similar to undergrad. And you have results and you get grades, and so you know how you're doing. And the PhD journey feels a little bit like being thrown in the deep end because you don't get grades, you don't know how you're doing. It's just a long road of absolute nothingness. And I think embracing that it's not going to be linear because life happens in the 3 or 4 years that you're doing your PhD, and just being more in acceptance, I would say, with that, because it's an entirely different, and people, throw cheesy quotes around like, oh, it's a marathon, not a race, but it says nothing. It says nothing about how you cope with a marathon and not a race. Like, how many people have actually run a marathon? Why do people say that? Anyway.
More and more people on my timeline these days. The older we get, people get into running. I don't know why.
Yeah, that's fair. I do run. I'm just like, it's just a different process. And I think it's hard to not be like, I'm just going to hit the ground running, and 3 years later I'm going to come out and it's going to be amazing, and I'm going to be amazing, and I'm going to have done all of these things. So I think just accept the fact that it's not going to be linear and that life is going to get in the way is probably my primary takeaway.
Awesome. Niusha, any final thoughts from you?
I am curious about what you're up to now and where you're going next. So what is the
good question? What am I up to now? Well, I've been a teaching fellow this whole year, which has been an interesting change of I don't want to say career, but like role, because I went from being primarily like a researcher to now primarily a teacher. And I will be lying if I said that I didn't love it. I really, really enjoyed teaching. It felt like doing science communication every single day. And that has kind of been, in some ways for me, in terms of career, an absolute disaster, because now I've loved it so much, I want to stay in it. And I don't academia is really struggling right now. And so I don't know if I'll have the opportunity to stay in it, but I really enjoyed talking to students and teaching them the things that I didn't get taught. Like a lot of my course was around how do you use social psychology and take a problem that exists in the real world and come up with a solution for it. And they really loved it. I got so much positive feedback around the content. So teaching has been where I've been at. I was like lucky and got this teaching fellow position. And I've been teaching the whole year, but in terms of like what I want to do next, I definitely want to develop the game further. And I am leaning into like the space I want to exist in. Like it always seems like there's one way to be an academic and I don't fit that way. And I definitely like the space between academia and getting it out into the world and making it into something. Like if someone could just hire me and be like, here's the research, can you figure out how to make something out of it? I'm your girl. Like that's where I want to exist. So yeah, that's basically what I've been up to.
Nice. If people have a job open which requires someone to
Yeah.
look at research and make it into something practical,
Yeah.
hit that up now.
Honestly, yeah. Like get in touch with me, like talking about it and then making it into something. I really like community resources. Like how do you help like solve community problems, like marginalized community problems? So don't call me if you like want some techie, like something in tech. I don't know. Like call me if you're gonna use tech as a solution for the thing. Yes, I will. That I can help you. But yeah.
Awesome. Anyway, thank you guys. Thank you, Nuzha. That was awesome. Only took 2 years. But
Maybe I'll come. Maybe part of my science communication dream would be
yes,
being on as a co-host or something.
go on. Yes. Well, we can start that off when we interview Niusha on her work next time. That would be a good start.
We'll see. That's where your 2 years of experience starts.
Don't worry, it starts today. Okay, take a note.
Just start taking notes now, Niush.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, thank you so much, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone, for listening as well. And yeah, until next time. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.